I first will start by apologizing for my voice. I've managed to avoid viruses for nearly 2 years, but have contracted a non-COVID virus. So apologies for the laryngitis. Usually I sound a little bit better than this, but thank you for listening. So let me share my slides and get started on this. As mentioned, this is work that I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my co-author Tugba, Basaran Akmazoglu, who is here with us as well. She'll be speaking to comment on a subsequent paper presentation. So here's what the roadmap of what I'd like to discuss with you. So I want to start by asking, is there anything new here? And the answer, I agree with Rafael Yuste, who's just spoken with you. I think there is something new here that warrants attention from the legal perspective. I'll go on to talk very briefly about what types of concerns are emerging and the role of the law. And the law is actually a diverse toolkit. There's all, as I'm speaking to a law school, you all know there's all kinds of different laws in the hierarchy of laws. They all have different pros and cons. They all achieve certain things and fail to achieve others. So when one faces a problem and wants to make a legal response, it's important to look at which element of the legal toolkit is best tailored to the problem at hand. But where I want to spend most of my time with you is in proposing a typology of the fundamental human interests at stake, because I'm going to become much more granular than Rafael was in talking at the high level with sort of high level abstract concepts of free will and so forth, and move down or approach it from a different angle. What might be the kinds of human interests in a neuroprosthesis, and what kinds of legal puzzles are thrown up, which would suggest to us that our existing legal categories and concepts might need tweaking to respond to these kinds of issues. And I'll conclude with a few legal puzzles for what I call hybrid minds. And a hybrid mind, in sort of the way I'm using the term, is a combination of a brain and a mind and hardware and some sort of software involving reading in or writing out, but often a kind of a closed loop kind of scenario in which it may become challenging to identify and separate the components of the emerging mind that is created by the confluence or the incorporation of all those things with each other. So how is all this different from prior prosthetic technologies? After all, we have millennia of human experience with tools of all kinds, many of which have affected the way we think and have affected our very bodies, actually, if one takes the long view of evolution and the use of different kinds of tools and fire and so forth. So here you have a picture of the Cairo toe, a rather nice looking prosthetic toe. Ludwig van Beethoven, whose hearing prostheses are captured on this stamp. These are sort of examples of this long history of replacing bodily parts or functions. Now, with neuroprostheses, if we have these kinds of tools that can write into the brain, as Rafael Yuste has explained to you, or read out information from the brain, this is a little bit different. This is getting sort of more direct, as it were. After Ludwig van Beethoven's ear trumpet was reading into the brain, obviously, and all of these things read into the brain in one way or the other, but via peripheral nervous system, via sensory apparatus and so forth. But with these neuroprostheses, the relationship, the directness of the interaction is closer. Another thing that is important here is, I think, the development of these adaptive closed loop systems, which allow for the changing of the stimulation in real time, which may be in response to biomarkers or other characteristics that are not obvious to the person. So the transparency of the system and its predictability look a bit different. The incorporation of artificial sensory feedback as well. I'll get to that later, but it points to a particular psychological or phenomenological experience with some of these devices that might be different than, for example, the Cairo toe. Again, these devices are being networked, which raises a whole host of other potential issues, and also miniaturization. And the elaboration of non-invasive techniques will probably expand their use for a broad range of indications. So you can see at the bottom, I've shown some of these sort of novel kinds of things coming up, implanted magnets allow people to pick up items with their magnetized fingers. There has been discussion of this bridging brains, or allowing for a BCI that enables brain-to-brain communication to actually influence behavior of someone on the other end, or even to have them see phosphenes or things like that, so to affect their visual perception. So these all look like a step change, I think, from the kinds of prior prostheses we've had to grapple with. So what does all this mean? What kinds of concerns are emerging? And you've already heard that there's a range of concerns being raised about, okay, well, we're going to gather all this data. We may start to make inferences about the mental contents of people. We may be able to influence their mental contents in a way that's perhaps different from the way we've done before. After all, we always influence each other's mental contents. I'm doing that to you right this very minute as you're sitting there listening to my scratchy, hoarse voice. But there is this issue about writing into people's other brains through various kinds of electrical stimuli, as opposed to via the ears and eyes, which is how I'm doing it right now. And so this gives rise to this call for the 5 NeuroRights. So I think this is an interesting and important development. I would say 1 or 2 quick things about the strategy of dealing with rights, and especially with international rights, is that they have particular strengths. They sensitize people and they encourage the development of a moral consensus around an issue. Whether or not they have legal effect is a different question. So for an international right to have legal effect, it needs to be translated into domestic law. And I'd also note that if you have a constitutional right, which is how I understand the call for NeuroRights to be operating at the domestic level, constitutional rights bind governments. They don't bind private actors. And so they are also articulated at a very, very high and abstract level, such as the right to life, the right to liberty, these kinds of things. And in essence, what you're doing when you put something like this in a right is you're articulating a very abstract and underdetermined legal point, and all of the content then has to be backfilled in by judges who will interpret its meaning over time in concrete cases and will balance those rights against other competing rights. And it's done, it in essence gives over to the judges the job of developing the meaning, and contrary to legislators, because the judges in this context are superior in terms of interpreting the Constitution and tend to constrain the legislatures. So I want to take a different approach here. I want to actually get really sort of a bit more granular and ask, what are the fundamental human interests at stake here? And do our existing legal concepts and categories adequately capture those interests? So I'm kind of ducking the question of, do we need NeuroRights? I think the answer might be possibly yes. That would all depend, I think, on the formulation and the particular concern. But I'm going to step aside and ask instead, what kinds of fundamental human interests are at stake that we might want to think about in this context? So I have 5 of them to propose to you, and I'm just going to double check how long I've been speaking so that I don't consume too much time and leave Walter no time. So the first, I guess I start with perhaps the most obvious, right? The physical interest in your neuroprosthesis. And so we can actually identify, this is probably not the only way to organize physical interest in prostheses, but I think it's an important one. In terms of the degree of integration, bodily or physical integration. So we can have wearable, we can have inserted or implanted, all the way to integrated at a cellular or even genetic level. So if we look at the use of optogenetics, gene therapies actually to change cells, so in the nervous system, so that they can be manipulated for clinically beneficial effects. So obviously, if we do gene therapy, that becomes more challenging to undo, just as an implanted device can be removed, but with some sort of damage and danger. Whereas a wearable one, the integration is less profound. So what does this mean legally then? Well, we have these categories in law. We tend to divide the body from objects. And objects can be property, bodies cannot. We tend to attribute greater protection, legal protection, to body from bodily damage than to property from property damage. And so bringing this to the criminal law, this of course depends upon the criminal codes of different countries, but speaking from the Canadian context, we see very different kinds of offenses aimed at property offenses, mischief and things like that, versus offenses against the person. And so when we think about the interest in the physical interest in the prosthesis, we're going to have to decide if someone interferes with this prosthesis, which particular form of crime ought to answer this. That's just one particular question. Another one might be outside the criminal context. What do we do with the enforcement of contracts involving the physical body? We generally don't tend to enforce them. It's contrary to public policy most of the time to fetter people's commitments to use their physical body in a certain way. What do we do in the context of research projects where maybe it involves the testing of an implanted device? Is the person at the end required to submit to explantation of that device or not? Or does that constitute part of the body as opposed to a retained piece of property that they're obliged to give up? So this second form of interest, I think, is quite interesting. What we're getting at here is the phenomenological interest as opposed to sort of the physical interest. And what we're getting at here is this idea of the incorporation into the body schema and also into the psychological makeup of the device. And so Merleau-Ponty spoke famously of the blind man and the stick, and how the stick recedes from awareness. It becomes transparent and the attention of the user is directed to the tip of the stick, and this becomes the point of interaction with the environment. And I think we've all had a similar experience writing. We don't think about the juncture between our fingers and the pen, but between the tip of the pen and the paper. And humans can be very flexible in incorporating objects into the body schema. And in fact, it's one of the desired features of a successful prosthesis that it become transparent, or to put another way, that it become embodied. Now, there's also this dimension of affective embodiment. And this means that the behavioral and physiological responses of the person to the, for example, endangerment of the prosthesis are just as if it were part of the body. And we can see this in the context of people who identify with their avatars in virtual reality. If the avatar is placed in danger on a sort of a cliff ledge, a person will show a similar stress response and vertigo. And there's also evidence that the brain reorganizes itself, provoked by long-term use of a device. So here I come back to haptic feedback. So if we have our person who has lost an arm and is using brain signals to manipulate this prosthetic arm, one of the things that is being done now is to feed back into the sensory system haptic feedback, so that the person can detect sort of sensation akin to pressure or touch from the fingertips of the prosthesis. And you can imagine how this would likely make for a phenomenological embodiment experience that is probably much stronger than if that haptic feedback were not provided. It would also make it easier to use the device. So here, again, coming to criminal law, what do you think one does with someone whose prosthetic limb is threatened, who responds violently to protect it? And we have differences in the criminal law between the scope of the self-defense, the defense of self-defense, when one is threatened with bodily injury versus when property is threatened. So should the criminal law respond to this violent reaction by saying, hey, that was just a prosthesis, my friend. You don't get to inflict bodily injury on someone else to defend it? Or do we accept that this is affectively embodied, and threatening it creates the same kind of reaction in a person as it would be to threaten the person's, in quotation marks, real arm? So my third example or type of interest would be what we call a survival interest in the prosthesis. So in extreme cases, prosthesis can be required for survival. And we see in the last few years, as different countries have grappled with triage protocols for ventilators, that there has been concern amongst those who are reliant on these technologies that somehow this might be taken from them and allocated according to some other sort of principles as to the best use of this scarce resource. And there's a quotation from a Neyman article in 2020 from Alice Wong, who says, "My vent's part of my body. For someone to take it away from me would be an assault on my personhood and lead to my death." But the point I'm trying to make here is the statement that it is part of her body. It is no longer an object that she uses as a supportive technology. It is part of the body. And I think it's no accident that the terminology is being, of like bodily integration here, is being invoked because of the greater tendency to protect the body over relationships with objects. Another point here I want to say, to bring it to neuroprostheses, is we can see similar survival interests in neuroprostheses. So one can come across quotations from people with chronic pain conditions saying, if I did not have my spinal cord stimulator, I would have killed myself, for example. One could also look at the developing neuroprostheses to support memory. I have a little screen grab from an article on a hippocampal neuroprosthesis. And if one takes the John Locke approach to personal identity, which sort of emphasizes the importance of psychological continuity to link together the person over time, it shows the incredible importance to survival of a person in a real way of the ability to remember and of consciousness. And so one could imagine, perhaps without stretching the thinking too far, that a neuroprosthesis that allows for the formation and retention of memories as essential to at least psychological survival of a person over time, enduring selfhood. So the next form of interest, we call it functional interests in prostheses, and this is sort of like a less dramatic version of the preceding. It's not so much the survival that's at stake, but some important function of the person. And a couple of examples that we've dug up just to illustrate what we mean here. There's Collins in the airline, referred to by Glenn in a 2012 article. And this was a case where a man relied on a pretty elaborate form of wheelchair. It did a lot more than just the simple analog chair with a couple of wheels. It was a complex piece of equipment that held him upright and helped him with a range of needs. An airline damaged it and he sued. Now, he was left for a year in bad state with getting pressure ulcers, having to hire all kinds of people to assist him with daily activities that he would otherwise have taken care of himself. Lengthy delay, eventually the wheelchair gets fixed, but he sues and he wants the consequential damages associated with this. And the airline points at the back of the ticket, which says, guess what? This was a baggage claim incident. This was a baggage. And look here, you clearly agreed that damages are limited to replacement. You got the replacement. That's the end of the story. Collins and his lawyer said, actually, this was not just some mere baggage. This was an extension of the body. And what happened here was you damaged my body. Now, this didn't go to court, so we didn't see a case out of this. But what was interesting is that this then later settled for a higher sum. So another example from France this time dealt with a woman who went to a dentist and to have denture created. She didn't pay for the dentures. She later went back to the same dentist who then took the dentures and wouldn't give them back to her. And so a lawsuit ensues. And initially the court said, well, this is just an object. The civil code allows for seizure of objects for non-payment. The appeal court disagreed and said, actually, no, some objects are an integral part of the human person. Now, this is interesting. The language here uses of person or personhood as opposed to body. And this reflects a difference between common law and civil law. It's sort of legal concepts, but the point is the same. I think this is the person or body and not property. So a couple of legal questions for you. What would happen if a prosthesis allowed for supernormal or enhanced functions? There's a little picture at the bottom of Stuart Harbison, who is colorblind and uses this antenna to create audible signals corresponding to colors and therefore gets information about the colors in his vicinity. So this is, I suppose, perhaps a bad example of a supernormal or enhanced bodily function. It's meant to replace his lack of ability to discern colors. But just imagine, for the sake of the discussion, someone has a supernormal enhanced function. What if that were damaged? How would we evaluate the harm associated with it? What would be the measure of damages? And here we have lots of experience in the law with sort of figuring out how to evaluate these rather difficult to evaluate things like the loss of a limb or pain and suffering. But how do we evaluate the loss of a supernormal function? That's a question. Another question for you, and this is sort of flows on from this article of a U of T professor here who had a sort of this complex visual apparatus. He got into a fight at a store, one of our Canadian Tire. It's a big local chain in Canada, and was thrown out. The staff didn't like him phoning, like videotaping him and so forth. So another question I think is interesting is how are people entitled to react defensively in relation to enhanced bodily functions? And what is the scope of permissible defensive reaction that we will contemplate? Okay, so let me move on. I have two more different, checking the time, I've got 2 minutes to cover my two last forms of human interest. So we propose also a social interest in prostheses, including neuroprostheses. So evidently, various kinds of disfigurements can lead to psychological reactions and psychosocial or interpersonal awkwardness and so forth. So you can see that there's an interpersonal function of prostheses of different types, the cosmetic prostheses. Prostheses also serve a social identity, a marker of a particular social group, for example. And there's a variety of interesting cases dealing with the appropriateness of police removing wigs from people when they are taken into police custody, for example. And this might have to do with people who use hair covering, women, Muslim women or Orthodox Jewish women. It has come up in the context of trans women as well. And so this is, a little far from a neuroprosthesis, but I just propose it to you as suggesting a class of concerns that flow from questions of social identity and interaction. And so if we bring it to neuroprosthesis, I refer back to the debate a couple of years ago about whether the use of cochlear implant in children was an instrument of ethnocide of the deaf community. And the argument here was the removal of the incoming members of a community would first constitute a harm to the child who didn't get to choose sort of their cultural destiny, but also harm the deaf community itself by not just sort of implicitly declaring that it's better not to be with that community, but also affecting their political strength by removing prospective members from that community. And I think as we move forward with neuroprostheses, and I'm thinking in particular deep brain stimulation for a range of conditions, psychiatric conditions, or even for autism, that similar arguments coming from the philosophy of neurodiversity are likely to be made. So neurodiversity, again, sort of suggests that particular neurological makeups ought not to be viewed as pathological or not, but as on a spectrum, much of which should be understood as different or diverse as opposed to pathological and in need of cure. So I suspect that similar sorts of arguments will come to be made there, perhaps not in relation to DBS because that's used only in the context of very severe psychiatric or neurocognitive issues, but perhaps for the non-invasive forms of brain stimulation and neuroprostheses. And then finally, the last human interest that I'd like to address is the informational interest in neuroprostheses. So what I'd like to say here is that these neuroprostheses in some way represent a rather novel form of access to point to the person, not just in terms of collecting information about them from their brain, which, as we've heard, we're sort of gradually getting around to figuring out how to interpret some of it. But also it's an access point for transmitting information into the brain. And so there are questions about what do we do with that novel access point? And are there ethical and legal consequences that we should be concerned with? And so let me sort of propose to you this case from the 2016 of the Compton case from the US. This was a man who had an implanted pacemaker and who was accused of burning down his own house, accused of arson. And the pacemaker data was subpoenaed and presented in court and analyzed with expert assistance by a cardiologist who concluded that the data was not consistent with his Compton's account of what he'd been up to at the time. So, question for you: should other data stored in this way, neural data in prostheses, be made available in a similar manner? And we can think of communication neuroprostheses that detect imagined speech, or other kind of contents of the mind. And I think this is an interesting question to think about. And as we move to the teleprogramming of implanted medical devices, there's been an awful lot during COVID discussion of teleneurology and tuning up your DBS device over the internet. As these become sort of linked to the internet, these issues of diverting this data in ways that one didn't expect, as well as compromising this data, become increasingly serious questions. And we have seen various implanted medical devices like insulin pumps recalled for cybersecurity reasons. And I leave you with one last sort of observation, that this new access point to the person, when we move into these neuroprostheses, this is not something that is going to be an access point to everyone. Right now, most of these are contemplated as clinical devices to assist people with disabilities. And so it's the people who have a disability that are getting this access port to their minds and bodies created by these devices. It's not everybody else. Now, so we may want to think about that in terms of the sort of the justice of the development of these technologies and the ability to collect information about the person. So I think I should probably conclude now, just to leave time for Walter, and we can pick up some of these other questions in the Q&A, hopefully. I think there's some really interesting legal puzzles here. And rather than consume time now, I would invite you, if you're interested and have time, which none of us do, to have a look at the paper that Tugba and I wrote. We consider some of these issues in greater detail there. So I will stop my share and get out of the way.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. That's great. And so I'll turn over to Walter now to reply.
Okay. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Tugba and Jennifer, actually, my comments are based on their chapter, which is really rich. Lots of interesting and important issues. Jennifer did discuss some of them. So what I'm going to do is divide my comments into two categories. One is informational interests, which Jennifer discussed last, and then what I just call roughly individual or identity interests, sorry. Okay, so one concern that many people have is about making information accessible to other people. Should it be, and do people have rights to protect this information? And what's one interesting thing that comes up here is Jennifer mentioned, it's not in the chapter, but in her discussion, brain-to-brain interfaces, which is where two or more brains are linked to execute certain visual, motor, or complex cognitive tasks. So here you have a case where the information is accessible to other people, and it raises the question of, who are the people to whom it should be accessible? And so what's permissible, what's acceptable, justifiable in terms of who has access to this information. Another interesting thing about brain-to-brain interfaces is it's another issue that Jennifer and Tugba discuss in their chapter, and that is intellectual property questions. So if you have two or more subjects and their brains that are sharing information, then one question is, who has the right to the property, intellectual property, concerned with or associated with the motor output, the output of whatever that task is using the BBI. So here you've got multiple brains involved in information that's shared across brains and subjects. So there are some interesting intellectual property questions there. Jennifer and Tugba also mentioned brain jacking. So here you have cases where information in the brain of someone who is using any kind of device, it could be deep brain stimulation, where there's an implant and information that's stored in the brain, where external unauthorized third parties gain access to it and disrupt the information. It's not just as important as, it's not just about disrupting information, but it also disrupts agency. And this came up in the last session. That is, an individual who's using a brain-computer interface, for example, to move a prosthetic limb or a robotic arm. So insofar as their intention to move activates brain signals, which issue in the motor output, that disrupts that. So that form of agency itself is being disrupted. So that's brain jacking is a significant problem that has to be dealt with. And Jennifer and Tugba raised this issue in their conclusion. They say the user's interest, that is a user of any sort of neurotechnology, has to be balanced against hardware, software developers. So device makers, it raises the question of what sort of obligations, moral or legal, do device makers have, if at all, in terms of trying to design these devices, designing the hardware and software to prevent or at least reduce the risk of interference like brain jacking. A more general point, which arises in all of these discussions, is mental privacy, mental integrity, which is used in the same context as neural data. So these seem to be used interchangeably. What's needed here, I think, is clarification, not just philosophically or neuroscientifically, but also legally, about what exactly is the connection between neural data and mental content. Personally, I'm not a reductionist. Some people are. But there is some need to discuss this and to clarify exactly what the relationship is between them. Are neural circuits, do they mediate mental content? Are they the same as that? And what does this, what sort of implications does it have, for example, for any sort of normative judgments made about people's behavior? So I think the mental and neural, that sort of relationship needs clarification. Okay. The other thing is not all information in the brain, which may be accessible to others, well, again, it depends on the parties to whom it's made accessible, is potentially harmful to the subject. For example, neural data from a microelectrode array implanted in the cortex of someone using a BCI because of motor impairment from a traumatic brain injury, that information could actually be helpful in terms of predicting neural degeneration from that brain injury. So there could be therapeutic potential to it as well. It's not just potentially harmful. Not that Jennifer said anything about this, or it's just that something that came up when I was reading the chapter. Okay, so that's those have to do with Those comments primarily with informational interests. Regarding the identity interests, Jennifer and Tugba in their chapter, they mentioned that they talk about these systems, neurotechnologies involving shared control or shared control systems. So it's not just the system that's doing all the work or the subject, but there's interaction between them. And that raises questions not only about rights or rights to non-interference regarding interventions in the brain or a right to protect information about the brain, but also responsibility in how a user uses the technology. It could be deep brain stimulation where the individual has the ability to turn the system on and off, the stimulator on and off. It could also be a brain-computer interface where the individual has the ability to translate an intention into moving a robotic arm, prosthetic limb, a computer cursor with a typing system, typing program. So that control, there's enough control of the individual to raise questions about responsibility, moral and criminal. It's related to what Jennifer was talking about in the first part of her discussion about regarding identity, that the limb, the prosthetic limb, the prosthetic, let's say, is something with which the individual identifies. And if we're talking about prosthetic limbs or robotic arms, for example, depending on interoceptive, exteroceptive, proprioceptive, and somatosensory processing, the individual it can be, as Jennifer said, it can be integrated or become a part of the individual's body schema. This is part of the phenomenological interest. And insofar as it integrates and becomes part of their body schema, they can identify with it as part of themselves. And it raises some interesting questions about the actus reus requirement in the criminal law. That is, even though some people may think of moving a robotic arm or a prosthetic limb as a disembodied movement, it could be, if the individual identifies with it, as a form of extended bodily movement. And if it's an extended bodily movement, which the individual performs voluntarily and intentionally, then it is the sort of thing for which they could be responsible. Those are my general comments and questions. And I don't want to take up any more time, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Walter. So a few raised a number of issues there. I was going to put over some questions, but I wonder whether either Jennifer or Tugba wanted to say anything in response before I put it over, or I can open up for questions.
Only to say thank you very, very much, Walter, for these interesting comments, and I've taken some notes here in my Cheshire Cat paper here. This last point you mentioned, this question of if you identify with the joint product of your neuroprosthesis and your own wetware and software mind, brain and mind, yeah, then you are responsible for it in a way. I think I think it may sometimes be that way, but I wonder about the kinds of neuroprostheses that directly manipulate mental content, and especially kind of subconscious contributors to our behavior. And so I guess what I have in mind here, let me give two examples to explain what I mean. So I'm very, very interested in the experience of people who have deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's, and some minority, as with drug therapy, but some minority who get DBS develop these impulse control disorders. And if one reads sort of qualitative interviews with some of them, they talk about feeling more themselves, even though their behavior can be dramatically different from before. So the changes are perhaps on some level, they may be aware of the behavior and change. And I think that the qualitative interviews suggest they are aware that something's changed, but to them, it feels fully egosyntonic. And so if you have a device that, for example, makes you identify with the change, then is it really your change? Is identification with the product or output enough to make it really you after all? So that's one point. And the other point I just want to make, which is sort of along the same kind of lines, is there's a really interesting paper by Hannah Maslin and Stephen Rainey talking about communication neuroprostheses. And I have a paper in review right now looking at the legal issues of communication neurotechnologies. And I learned a lot from their paper because they talk about if we think of the experience of speaking, we, especially when we're speaking in our own native language, I don't sit here and plot out a full sentence and then utter it. In other words, I have a communicative intention, but what comes out of my mouth, you sort of hear it at the same time as I do, right? It sort of comes into being. We become conscious of that content at the same time. And so if we have, and so what is going on there? Am I retrospectively kind of assuming that what comes out of my mouth is what I meant to say? That's usually the case, although sometimes you realize, wait, where did that come from? And you correct it. But so we don't seem to have too much trouble in normal speech in assigning to people responsibility over their spoken utterances. So is the fact that some sort of neurotechnology is going to interpret signals over their motor cortex and produce some speech any different? Do we worry that they're not really responsible for their spoken utterances because there's some sort of decoding and autocorrect and all that kind of stuff? And I wonder if it's actually just in the same way we don't really understand without the communication neurotechnology what we're going to say. We're equally sort of in the dark until it emerges. And what really is important is the ability for the person to give an after the fact correction or endorsement of what it was they said, which is sort of how we operate. So I guess my point there is, in terms of identifying with the product of the device, maybe the communication neurotechnology example shows, yeah, that's the way we do it anyway with speech. So maybe it is enough to identify with some kinds of neuroprostheses. I have more concerns with those that actually deliberately manipulate affect, attention, cognitive control, and such like, because I think a person can be made to identify with something that they wouldn't otherwise have.
Well, there's a lot there. Let me just say this. I think whether one identifies with it and retains control, behavior control, thought control, depends on two things. One is their interest in utilizing the neurotechnology, and the other is whether they retain insight. That is, and how much conscious control do they have and how these things go. Okay, so let me start with interest. There's a well-known case, some of you may know about this, others may not, of a patient in the Netherlands who had Parkinson's disease. And he underwent deep brain stimulation. This was in the early 2000s. And the technique controlled his motor problems, restored motor control, but he developed hypomania. So that was an affective side effect, sequelae from the treatment. But when he wasn't being stimulated, he retained enough insight to say that the loss of motor control was so severe and made him suffer so much that restoring that control was the thing he was most interested in. And if there was nothing he could do about the affective side effect of hypomania, then he still would, it was more important for him to maintain motor control. So, I mean, there's still a question about whether he had control, because if he became hypomanic, but what that underscores to me is the importance of the interest in the individual has in, I mean, whatever sort of pathology or disorder they have, in restoring the sort of control they want. And importantly, this is relevant to responsibility, how much insight, whether they retain enough insight into what's happened to them and their state of mind and their behavior. So these would be the sorts of things to keep in mind.